The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Berkeley University's oldest mathematics building. Professor Alan Wright walked with quick steps down the hallway. His leather shoes made sharp sounds against the floor. He carried a worn brown briefcase filled with papers he had not yet graded. He was late for his own class, which was not like him at all. Alan Wright was 62 years old with gray hair that had started to thin on top. He wore the same type of outfit almost every day: brown pants, a button-up shirt, and a tweed jacket, with patches on the elbows. Students often joked that he probably slept in his tweed jackets. He had taught advanced calculus at Berkeley for over 20 years, and had earned a reputation as one of the toughest professors on campus. Alan loved mathematics more than anything else in the world, but he also loved being the smartest person in any room. He was known for asking difficult questions to students who arrived late or looked unprepared. Many students feared his class, but they all admitted that they learned a lot from him. Today was the third week of the fall semester. The class was Advanced Calculus 2, and only the best math students dared to take it. The classroom could hold about 100 students, and every seat was filled when Alan finally pushed open the heavy wooden door. "Good morning," he said in a loud voice as he walked to the front of the room. He did not apologize for being late. He placed his briefcase on the desk and looked out at the sea of young faces. Most of the students had already opened their textbooks and notebooks. They knew that every minute in Professor Wright's class was important. Today we will continue our discussion of differential equations and their real-world applications, Alan announced as he began writing on the large blackboard that covered the front wall of the classroom. His handwriting was neat and precise, each symbol perfectly formed. "Please turn to page 143 in your textbooks." The sound of pages turning filled the room. Alan smiled to himself. He enjoyed this power, this control over the classroom. These young minds were here to learn from him, and he took that responsibility seriously, even if he sometimes enjoyed making students uncomfortable. In the middle of explaining a particularly difficult concept, Alan noticed movement at the back of the room. The door had opened and someone was slipping in quietly, trying not to disturb the class. Alan always noticed latecomers. He often used them as examples to reinforce his strict policies about punctuality. "Excuse me," Alan said, stopping his lecture mid-sentence. "We begin class precisely at 9:30. It is now." He looked at his wristwatch. 9:47. I do not appreciate interruptions. The students turned in their seats to look at the latecomer. A wave of whispers spread through the classroom, like a gentle breeze. Alan could not yet see who had entered because the person was still in the shadows at the back of the room. "Perhaps our late arrival would like to explain to the class why their time is more valuable than everyone else's," Alan said with a sharp edge to his voice. The figure moved forward into the light and a collective gasp filled the room. It was Clint Eastwood. The famous actor and director known for his tough guy roles in award-winning films was standing in Alan Wright's calculus classroom. He looked older than he did in his movies, but his presence was unmistakable. He stood tall with his shoulders back, his face serious and calm. He wore simple clothes, blue jeans, a light blue button-up shirt, and a brown jacket. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed Hollywood star. But everyone knew who he was. Alan's mouth opened slightly in surprise. This was not what he had expected. For a moment he was speechless, which almost never happened to him. Clint Eastwood spoke in his familiar raspy voice. "Sorry for the interruption, Professor. The campus security took some time to direct me to the right building." More whispers filled the room. Students were nudging each other, pointing discreetly and pulling out their phones to take pictures. One student near the front, Lisa Brown, actually pinched herself to make sure she wasn't dreaming. Alan quickly regained his composure. "Well, Mr. Eastwood, we are honored by your presence, but in this classroom everyone follows the same rules." He tried to sound firm, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "May I ask why you are joining us today?" Clint moved toward an empty seat in the back row. "I'm researching for a new film, playing a math teacher. Thought I'd sit in on some real classes to get a feel for it." His voice was quiet but carried through the now silent room. Alan nodded slowly, This made sense. Actors often research their roles by observing real-life counterparts. But having Clint Eastwood in his classroom was going to be a distraction, and Alan Wright did not like distractions. "Very well," Alan said, turning back to the blackboard. "But please understand that I expect full attention from everyone in this room, regardless of their celebrity status." Clint Eastwood nodded once and sat down. He pulled out a small notebook and a pen from his jacket pocket and looked attentively at the blackboard. Alan tried to continue his lecture, but he found it difficult to concentrate. Not only were the students constantly stealing glances at the famous actor, but Alan himself kept wondering what Clint Eastwood was thinking. Was he judging Alan's teaching style? Was he finding the material too complex? Too boring? A thought began to form in Alan's mind. Here was a perfect opportunity to show everyone just how complex and important mathematics was. If he could make Clint Eastwood, this symbol of tough masculinity and Hollywood success, look confused or out of his depth, it would reinforce Alan's own status as an intellectual authority. "Mr. Eastwood," Alan said suddenly, turning from the blackboard, "since you're researching the role of a mathematics teacher, perhaps you'd like a more immersive experience? Would you care to come solve this problem for us?" The equation on the board was one of the more difficult ones from the textbook. Alan had been planning to walk the students through it step by step, as it required a deep understanding of the concepts they had covered in the previous 2 weeks. The students turned to look at Clint Eastwood, many with expressions of sympathy. They knew Professor Wright was setting him up for embarrassment. No one expected an actor to be able to solve advanced calculus problems, even if he was playing a math teacher in a movie. Clint Eastwood looked at the blackboard for a long moment. His face revealed nothing. Then, to everyone's surprise, he stood up. "I'll give it a try," he said in his calm, quiet voice. As Clint walked slowly to the front of the room, Alan felt a surge of satisfaction. This would be a good lesson for everyone about respecting the complexity of mathematics. It would put things in their proper order. Hollywood glamour was no match for real intellectual achievement. What Alan Wright didn't know was that before becoming an actor, Clint Eastwood had been exceptionally good at mathematics in school. What no one in the room knew was that throughout his long career in Hollywood, Eastwood had maintained a private interest in mathematics, reading textbooks, and solving problems as a way to relax between films. It was a side of himself he rarely shared with anyone. Clint Eastwood took the chalk from Alan's hand. Their eyes met briefly. Alan thought he saw something in Eastwood's gaze, not nervousness or embarrassment, but something else, something that made Alan suddenly uncomfortable. The famous actor turned to face the blackboard, and the entire classroom held its breath. The classroom was completely silent as Clint Eastwood stood at the blackboard. He held the piece of chalk between his fingers and studied the complex equation Professor Wright had written. The white symbols and numbers seemed to float on the black surface. Every student watched with wide eyes. No one dared to even whisper. Professor Wright crossed his arms and leaned against his desk. A small smile played on his lips. He was sure that the famous actor would struggle with the problem. After all, this was advanced calculus. It had taken Alan years to master these concepts. No Hollywood actor could simply walk in and solve such a difficult equation. "Take your time, Mr. Eastwood," Alan said, his voice dripping with fake kindness. "Feel free to admit if it's beyond your abilities. This is graduate-level mathematics, after all." Clint Eastwood didn't respond. He continued to look at the equation. His face remained calm, showing no signs of worry or confusion. After about 30 seconds of studying the problem, he raised the chalk and began to write. His hand moved with surprising confidence. The chalk made soft scratching sounds against the board as Eastwood worked through the first steps of the solution. His handwriting was neat and clear, much like Professor Wright's own style. Alan's smile began to fade. The actor wasn't just randomly writing numbers. He was following a logical approach to solving the differential equation. Alan watched as Eastwood correctly identified the type of equation and began applying the proper method to solve it. The students sensed the shift in the room. Some exchanged confused glances. Others leaned forward in their seats, suddenly more interested in the math than in the celebrity. One student in the front row, Joe Porter, actually gasped when Eastwood used a clever substitution technique that even Alan hadn't taught them yet. That's the Bernoulli method," Joe whispered to the student next to him. "We haven't covered that yet." Alan heard the comment and felt a strange tightness in his chest. The Bernoulli method was indeed the correct approach for this particular problem, but it wasn't something he expected anyone in the class to know about yet. It certainly wasn't something he expected Clint Eastwood to know about. Eastwood continued, working, line after line of calculations flowing from his chalk. There was no hesitation, no erasing, no stopping to reconsider. It was as if the solution was already in his head, and he was simply copying it onto the board. The equation required several steps. First, identifying the type of differential equation, then making a substitution to transform it into a simpler form. Next, applying the integration factor method. Finally, solving for the general solution. Each step built on the previous one, and a single mistake could lead to a completely wrong answer. But Eastwood made no mistakes. His work was precise and methodical. After about 5 minutes of steady writing, he placed a box around his final answer, a perfectly correct solution to the problem. The classroom remained silent, but now it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of shock and confusion. Even Alan stood speechless, his arms no longer confidently crossed, but hanging loosely at his sides. Clint Eastwood placed the chalk on the small ledge at the bottom of the blackboard. He turned to face the class, his expression still calm and neutral. "Is that correct, Professor?" he asked, his raspy voice breaking the silence. Alan cleared his throat and stepped forward to examine the work more closely. He traced each step, with his eyes looking for any error, any small mistake that would explain how an actor could have solved a problem that would challenge even his best students. There were no mistakes. The solution was perfect. In fact, Eastwood had used a more elegant approach than Alan would have used himself. "It's correct," Alan admitted, unable to keep the surprise out of his voice. "Perfectly correct." A murmur swept through the classroom. Students began to whisper to each other, pointing at the board, taking pictures with their phones. The famous actor had just solved a complex calculus problem that many of them would have struggled with. "May I return to my seat?" Eastwood asked politely. Alan nodded, still too stunned to speak properly. As Eastwood walked back to his place in the last row, the students watched him with new eyes. He was no longer just a celebrity disrupting their class. He was something else entirely, a mystery. Alan tried to regain control of the situation. "Well, that was unexpected. Let's continue with our lesson." He turned to the board and began to erase Eastwood's work, but his hand trembled slightly. His carefully constructed world had just been shaken. For the rest of the class, Alan struggled to focus. He made small mistakes in his explanations. Something that rarely happened. The students noticed. Some of them smiled behind their hands. Others looked confused, glancing back and forth between their strict professor and the quiet actor in the back row. When the class finally ended, the students were slow to leave. Many of them lingered, hoping to speak to Clint Eastwood. A small crowd formed around him as he packed his notebook into his jacket pocket. "Mr. Eastwood, where did you learn calculus?" one student asked. "How did you know to use the Bernoulli method?" asked another. Clint Eastwood answered their questions with simple, short responses. "I've always liked math," he said. "Read a lot of books on it over the years." Alan watched from his desk, pretending to organize his papers. He felt a mix of emotions: embarrassment, confusion, curiosity, and something close to anger. This was his classroom, his domain. Mathematics was his life's work, not some hobby for Hollywood stars. As the last students filed out, Eastwood approached Alan's desk. The two men looked at each other for a long moment. "Thank you for the opportunity, Professor Wright," Eastwood said. "It's been a while since I've worked through a problem like that on a blackboard." Alan straightened his back. "Where did you learn advanced calculus, Mr. Eastwood?" "That wasn't beginner's luck." A small smile appeared on Eastwood's weathered face. Before I got into acting, I spent 2 years studying engineering. Math was always my best subject. Over the years, I kept up with it. Reading, solving problems, it helps me think clearly. So you're not actually researching for a film role? Alan asked, feeling even more foolish now. No, I am, Eastwood replied. But I didn't say I didn't know mathematics. You just assumed that. The words hit Alan like a physical blow. He had assumed. He had judged based on Eastwood's profession, his celebrity status. He had tried to use mathematics as a weapon to embarrass someone he deemed intellectually inferior, without bothering, to find out if his assumption was correct. Will you be coming back to the class? Alan asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. If that's all right with you, Eastwood said. I find your teaching style interesting. There was something in the way he said interesting that made Alan wonder if Eastwood had seen right through him from the beginning. Had the actor known what Alan was trying to do? Had he anticipated the challenge and been ready for it? Of course, Alan said stiffly. The class meets again on Thursday. Eastwood nodded and turned to leave. At the door, he paused and looked back. You know, Professor, in my line of work, I've learned that people are rarely what they first appear to be. The quiet ones sometimes have the loudest minds. With that, he left, leaving Alan alone in the empty classroom. The professor sat heavily in his chair, looking at the blackboard where traces of Eastwood's neat handwriting were still visible despite his attempts to erase it. For the first time in many years, Alan Wright felt like he was the student, not the teacher. And he wasn't sure he liked the lesson. News spread quickly around the Berkeley campus. By lunchtime, everyone had heard about how Clint Eastwood had solved a difficult calculus problem in Professor Wright's class. Students who hadn't been there wished they had. Teachers in other departments were curious. The math department was buzzing with talk. Alan Wright sat alone in the faculty cafeteria, pushing his food around on his plate. He had no appetite. His mind kept replaying the morning's events. The confident way Eastwood had approached the blackboard, the perfect solution, the subtle message in his parting words. Alan felt like a fool, and he did not like that feeling at all. Mind if I join you? A voice asked. Alan looked up to see Dr. Samantha Green, the head of the mathematics department. She was a tall woman with short gray hair and kind eyes behind round glasses. She had been Alan's colleague for 15 years and was one of the few people he genuinely respected. Please, Alan said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Samantha sat down and placed her tray on the table. I hear you had an interesting class this morning, she said with a small smile. Alan sighed. News travels fast. When it involves Clint Eastwood solving differential equations? Yes, it does, Samantha said. Is it true? Every word, Alan admitted. He solved it perfectly, better than I would have explained it to the class. Samantha took a bite of her sandwich, watching Alan's face carefully. And this bothers you because... Alan looked around to make sure no one was listening. Because I tried to embarrass him. Sam? I saw him as just some actor who was disrupting my class. I thought I could put him in his place by challenging him with a difficult problem. And instead, he put you in your place, Samantha said. It wasn't a question. Alan nodded, feeling the embarrassment fresh again. He mentioned he studied engineering before acting, said he's kept up with mathematics as a hobby all these years. Interesting, Samantha said. You know, there's a rumor that he published some mathematical papers years ago under a pen name. Alan looked up, surprised. Really? Do you know what name? Samantha shook her head. It's just a rumor, but I'm more interested in what you're going to do now. He's coming back to your class on Thursday, isn't he? He said he would, Alan replied. I'm not sure what to do. I've never been in a situation like this before. Maybe that's the problem, Samantha said gently. Maybe you've been the unchallenged king of your classroom for too long. Maybe this is a good thing. Alan didn't respond. He wasn't ready to see this as a good thing yet. After lunch, Alan went to the university library. He sat at one of the computers and began searching for mathematical papers that might have been written by Clint Eastwood under a different name. It was a wild guess, but he was curious now. He tried various combinations of Eastwood's names, initials, and birth year. Nothing relevant appeared. He was about to give up when he remembered something. In the 1960s and 1970s, Eastwood had played a character called the Man with No Name in several famous Western films. On a hunch, Allen searched for mathematics papers authored by anonymous or no name during those decades. To his surprise, he found something. 3 papers published in respected mathematics journals between 1965 and 1978, authored by C.E. Anonymous. The topics were related to applied mathematics and its use in physical modeling, exactly the kind of mathematics that would be useful in engineering. Allen clicked on the first paper and began to read. The writing style was clear and straightforward, much like Eastwood's work on the blackboard had been. There was no way to prove these papers were written by Eastwood, but Allen had a strong feeling they were. He printed the papers and took them back to his office. For the rest of the afternoon, he read them carefully, making notes in the margins. The work was impressive. Not revolutionary, but solid and creative. If Eastwood had written these papers, he was more than just someone who had studied some math in college. He had a genuine talent for it. That evening, Allen went home still thinking about Eastwood and the papers. His wife, Mary, noticed his distraction during dinner. "What's wrong, Allen?" she asked. "You've barely touched your food." Allen told her about his day, about Eastwood coming to his class, about the challenge, about finding the papers. Mary listened, without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Do you remember what you told me when we first met?" she asked finally. Allen looked confused. "What does that have to do with this?" "You told me you became a mathematician because you loved how numbers don't lie," Mary said. "You said mathematics was pure and honest with no room for deception or false appearances." "I remember," Allen said softly. "It sounds like you forgot that somewhere along the way," Mary said. "You started using mathematics not as a way to find truth, but as a way to prove your own superiority." The words hurt, because Allen knew they were true. Over the years, his love for mathematics had become tangled with his pride. He had begun to see his knowledge not as a gift to share, but as a weapon to wield. "What should I do?" he asked his wife. Mary reached across the table and took his hand. "Start by remembering why you loved mathematics in the first place. Then maybe apologize to Mr. Eastwood." The next day, Allen went to his office early. He had 2 classes to teach, neither of which included Clint Eastwood. But he knew he would see the actor again tomorrow, and he wanted to be prepared. He took out the 3 papers he had printed and read them again. Then he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He opened a blank notebook and began to work through some of the problems and ideas presented in the papers, exploring them, testing them, learning from them. For a few hours, he forgot about his pride and his embarrassment. He just enjoyed the mathematics for its own sake. In the afternoon, there was a knock on his office door. When Allen called, "Come in," the door opened to reveal Clint Eastwood. Allen stood up quickly, surprised. "Mr. Eastwood, I wasn't expecting you." "Call me Clint," Eastwood said. He glanced at the papers on Allen's desk and a slight smile appeared on his face. "I see you've been doing some research." Allen looked down at the printed papers. "Are these yours? Did you write them under the name C.E. Anonymous?" Eastwood didn't answer immediately. He walked into the office and closed the door behind him. "Those papers were written a long time ago," he said finally, "during breaks between films. I never wanted to use my real name. Didn't want the attention." "Why?" Allen asked. "These are good. You could have had a career in mathematics." Eastwood shrugged. "I chose a different path, but I never stopped loving the numbers." He pointed to the notebook where Allen had been working. "What were you doing with them?" "Just exploring," Allen said. "Some of your approaches are quite creative. I was testing them on some other problems." Eastwood nodded, seeming pleased. "That's what it's all about, isn't it? The exploration, the testing, the discovery." "Yes," Allen said, feeling a connection with this man that he hadn't expected. That's exactly what it's about. Eastwood looked at his watch. I need to go. I have a meeting with the film department. They want me to give a talk about directing. Will I see you tomorrow in class? Alan asked. Yes, Eastwood said. I'm looking forward to it. As Eastwood turned to leave, Alan said, Mr. Eastwood, Clint, I owe you an apology for yesterday. I made assumptions about you, and I tried to use mathematics to embarrass you. That was wrong of me. Eastwood looked at Alan for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded once. Apology accepted, Professor. See you tomorrow. After Eastwood left, Alan sat back down at his desk. He felt lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he was excited about tomorrow's class. Thursday morning arrived with a sense of anticipation. Alan Wright woke up earlier than usual and took extra care getting ready. He chose his best tweed jacket and a crisp white shirt. He wanted to look professional today. More than that, he wanted to be professional. When he arrived at his classroom, he was surprised to find it was already half full, even though class wasn't scheduled to start for another 20 minutes. Word had spread about Clint Eastwood's attendance, and now students from other classes were trying to squeeze in. Some sat on the steps along the sides of the room. Others stood at the back. This is a closed class, Alan announced as he set his briefcase on the desk. If you're not registered for Advanced Calculus 2, I must ask you to leave. A collective groan rose from about a third of the people in the room. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to file out. Alan felt a twinge of sympathy for them, but rules were rules. Besides, this wasn't a show. It was a mathematics class. As the extra students left, Alan noticed a woman at the back of the room who wasn't moving to leave. She was older than the students, maybe in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a simple blue dress and carried a large handbag. Alan didn't recognize her, but something about her seemed familiar. Before he could ask who she was, the door opened again and Clint Eastwood walked in. Today he arrived on time, even a few minutes early. He nodded at Alan and started to walk to the same seat he had occupied on Tuesday. As he passed the silver-haired woman, she reached out and touched his arm. Clint, she said softly. Eastwood turned, surprised. A rare smile spread across his face. Betty, he said. What are you doing here? The woman named Betty smiled back. When I heard you were attending classes here, I had to come see for myself. It's been a long time. Alan watched this exchange with curiosity. Who was this woman and how did she know Clint Eastwood? Eastwood seemed to notice Alan's confusion. He guided Betty forward. Professor Wright, I'd like you to meet Betty Harper. We knew each other many years ago. Betty extended her hand to Alan. Professor Wright, it's a pleasure. I've heard a lot about you. Alan shook her hand, still confused. It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Harper. Are you a friend of Mr. Eastwood's? Betty's eyes twinkled. You could say that. I was a mathematics teacher at Los Angeles City College in the early 1960s. Clint was one of my students. Alan's eyes widened. So this was the teacher Eastwood had mentioned, the one who had shown him the beauty of mathematics before he became an actor. Mrs. Harper was the best teacher I ever had, Eastwood said, his voice warm with respect. She saw something in me that others missed. Betty patted Eastwood's arm affectionately. You were a natural with numbers, Clint. I just helped you see it for yourself. Alan felt a strange mix of emotions. Here was a woman who had done what he had failed to do, recognize the potential in someone, and nurture it rather than try to use knowledge as a weapon. Mrs. Harper, would you like to stay for the class? Alan asked impulsively. It would be an honor to have you. Betty smiled. I would like that very much, Professor Wright. As the regular students filed in and took their seats, Alan prepared for the day's lesson. He had decided to do something different today. Instead of continuing with the planned curriculum, he wanted to explore some of the ideas he had found in the papers written by C. Anonymous and by Clint Eastwood. When everyone was seated and the room was quiet, Alan began. Today we're going to take a slight detour from our syllabus. We're going to explore some fascinating applications of differential equations in physical modeling. He turned to the blackboard and began to write. As he did, he explained the concept, which was based directly on one of Eastwood's papers. He didn't mention the source yet, but he saw Eastwood shift in his seat, recognizing his own work. This approach was first proposed in a paper published in 1972, Alan said, turning back to face the class. It was written by someone under the name C.E. Anonymous, but I believe we have the actual author with us today. All eyes turned to Clint Eastwood, who remained calm despite the sudden attention. Mr. Eastwood, would you care to explain this concept to the class? Alan asked. I believe you have a unique perspective on it. There was a moment of silence. Alan worried that he had overstepped, that Eastwood might be uncomfortable having his secret mathematical past exposed. But then Eastwood stood up and walked to the front of the room. Thank you, Professor, he said quietly. Then he turned to the class. This approach came to me while I was working on a film in Spain. We were shooting in the mountains, and I noticed how the wind moved in patterns around the peaks. For the next 15 minutes, Eastwood explained his mathematical model in simple, clear terms. He spoke about how he had observed natural phenomena and translated them into equations. His deep voice filled the room, and every student listened with complete attention. Even Alan found himself captivated by Eastwood's explanation, which made complex concepts seem intuitive and almost obvious. When Eastwood finished, the class erupted in applause. He nodded once, seeming slightly embarrassed by the reaction, and returned to his seat. Alan stepped forward again. Thank you, Mr. Eastwood. That was an excellent explanation. He turned to the class. What we just heard demonstrates something important about mathematics. It's not just about solving equations or memorizing formulas. It's about observing the world and finding the patterns within it. For the rest of the class, Alan built on Eastwood's explanation, showing how the concept could be applied to other problems. The students were more engaged than Alan had ever seen them. They asked questions, offered ideas, made connections. It was the kind of class Alan had always wanted to lead, but had somehow lost sight of in his focus on rigor and authority. When the class ended, the students were slow to leave. Many of them approached Eastwood, asking him questions about his mathematical work and, yes, about his films too. He answered patiently with the same quiet confidence he showed in everything. Betty Harper approached Alan as he packed up his materials. That was a wonderful class, Professor Wright, she said. You're a gifted teacher. Alan smiled ruefully. I'm not sure about that, but I'm trying to be better. Betty nodded. That's all any of us can do. Keep trying to be better. She glanced over at Eastwood, who was still surrounded by students. He never wanted recognition for his mathematical work, you know. That's why he used a pen name. Why? Alan asked. Most people would want credit for work like that. Betty considered the question. Clint has always understood something that many people don't. True satisfaction comes from the work itself, not from others knowing you did it. Alan thought about his own career, about how much he had come to care about his reputation and status. That's a hard lesson to learn, he said. Yes, Betty agreed. But it's never too late to learn it. As the last students left, Eastwood and Betty joined Alan at the front of the room. That was a good class, Professor, Eastwood said. You found a way to make my old work relevant to these students. Your work stands on its own, Alan said honestly. I just presented it. Betty looked between the two men and smiled. Clint, I was thinking of having lunch at that little cafe we used to go to. It's still there, just off campus. Would you join me? You too, Professor Wright, if you're free. Alan checked his watch. I'd be honored, Mrs. Harper. As the three of them walked out of the classroom together, Alan felt a sense of change within himself. For years, he had seen mathematics as his personal domain, a way to prove his worth. Now he was beginning to see it again as what it truly was, a language for understanding the world meant to be shared, not hoarded. The small cafe just off campus had changed little over the years. It still had the same red and white checkered tablecloths, the same wooden chairs, and the same friendly owner who greeted Betty Harper like an old friend. They found a table by the window, where sunlight streamed in through clean glass. I used to come here almost every day, Betty told Alan as they sat down. Clint and I would meet to discuss mathematics over coffee. Clint Eastwood nodded, looking around the cafe with a hint of nostalgia in his eyes. Best coffee near campus, he said. And quiet enough to think. The owner, a man in his 70s named Joe, came over to take their order. He did a double take. When he saw Eastwood, "Well, I'll be," Joe said, his eyes wide. "Clint Eastwood. Never thought I'd see you back here after all these years." Eastwood shook the man's hand. "Good to see you, Joe. Place looks the same." "Can't improve on perfection," Joe said with a grin. "What can I get you folks?" They ordered sandwiches and coffee. When Joe left, Alan looked at Eastwood curiously. "So you really did spend a lot of time here as a student?" he said. "It wasn't just something you said." "Clint never lies," Betty said firmly. "That's one of the things I always respected about him. Even when he decided to leave mathematics for acting, he was honest about it." "Why did you leave?" Alan asked Eastwood. "From what I've seen in your papers, you had real talent." Eastwood took a sip of water before answering. "I loved mathematics," he said. "Still do. But acting offered something different. A way to tell stories, to connect with people. I found I needed that too." "But you kept up with mathematics all these years," Alan pointed out. "You even published papers under a pen name." Eastwood nodded. "Some people play golf to relax. I solve equations." Betty laughed softly. "I remember when you called me from Spain to discuss that paper about wind patterns. You were so excited about the connection you'd made. You helped me refine it," Eastwood said. "Your feedback was always valuable." Alan watched the easy way these two interacted, the mutual respect clear in every word and gesture. It was the kind of relationship he had rarely developed with his own students. He had kept them at a distance, seeing them as people to impress, rather than minds to nurture. Their food arrived and the conversation shifted to other topics. Betty talked about her years of teaching and how she had seen mathematics education change over time. Eastwood shared stories about how he had used mathematical concepts to plan camera angles and timing in his films. Alan found himself talking about his own journey into mathematics, about the joy he had felt when he first understood the elegant logic of calculus. "That's what I try to share with my students," Betty said. "Not just the how of mathematics, but the why. The beauty of it." "I've lost sight of that," Alan admitted. "Somewhere along the way I started caring more about being right than about sharing what I love about mathematics." Betty patted his hand gently. "Recognition is important to all of us. There's nothing wrong with wanting your expertise to be acknowledged. But it became more than that for me," Alan said. "I started using my knowledge as a way to feel superior. That's why I tried to embarrass you," he added, looking at Eastwood. "I saw you as just a celebrity who couldn't possibly understand my world." "We all make assumptions," Eastwood said simply. "The question is what we do after we realize they're wrong." After lunch, they walked back to campus together. The day was warm, and students lounged on the grass, studying or talking in small groups. Some looked up as they passed, recognizing Eastwood or Professor Wright or both. "How much longer will you be in town?" Alan asked Eastwood. "Another week," Eastwood replied. "We start filming next month, so I'm doing research now." "And will you continue coming to my class?" Alan asked. Eastwood nodded. "If that's still all right with you." "More than all right," Alan said. "In fact, I was wondering if you might consider giving a guest lecture. Not about acting, but about your mathematical work. The applications you found in filmmaking could be fascinating for the students." Eastwood looked surprised. "You want me to teach your class?" "Just one session," Alan said. "Think about it. You don't have to decide now." Betty smiled as she listened to this exchange. "I think it's a wonderful idea," she said. "Clint was always good at explaining complex concepts in simple terms. That's a rare gift." They reached the mathematics building and stopped at the entrance. Betty checked her watch. "I should be going," she said. "I'm staying with my daughter in Oakland, and I promised to be back for dinner. She hugged Eastwood goodbye and shook Alan's hand warmly. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Professor Wright. I hope we'll see each other again." "I hope so, too," Alan said sincerely. After Betty left, Alan and Eastwood stood in silence for a moment. Then Eastwood said, "She changed my life, you know. I was just taking a math class to fulfill a requirement. She saw something in me that I didn't see in myself." "That's what the best teachers do," Alan said. "I used to want to be that kind of teacher. I think I'd like to try again." Eastwood nodded. "It's never too late." Over the next week, Alan's class changed. With Eastwood present as a student, Alan found himself teaching differently. He was less focused on impressing the class, with his own knowledge, and more interested in helping them discover the beauty and utility of mathematics for themselves. He asked more questions and gave fewer answers. He encouraged discussion and debate, and the students responded. They asked better questions. They stayed after class to continue conversations. They formed study groups not just to prepare for tests, but to explore ideas that interested them. On Eastwood's last day, Alan invited him to the front of the class again. This time it wasn't a challenge or a test. It was an opportunity to share. Eastwood spoke about how he had used mathematical principles in his work as a director, how calculus helped him understand the motion of a camera, how geometry informed the composition of a shot, how equations could model the emotional rhythm of a scene. The students were captivated. So was Alan. He saw mathematics through new eyes, not as an abstract realm separate from the real world, but as a tool for understanding and creating in every field, even art. After class, as the students filed out, Alan thanked Eastwood. "You've taught me as much as I've taught them this past week," he said. Eastwood shook his hand. "That's how it should be. We're all teachers and students at the same time." Before he left, Eastwood gave Alan a small envelope. "Something to remember our time by," he said. Alan waited until he was alone to open it. Inside was a page from an old notebook, yellowed with age. On it was a handwritten equation with a note at the bottom. "The Mathematics of Light and Shadow." CE, it was dated 1971, the year Eastwood directed his first film. Alan carefully placed the page in a frame and hung it on his office wall. In the years that followed, whenever a student asked about it, he would tell the story of the actor who came to his class and taught him what it truly meant to be a teacher. And when Alan eventually published his own book on the applications of mathematics in art and film, he dedicated it to two people: Betty Harper, who understood the heart of teaching, and Clint Eastwood, who reminded him why he fell in love with mathematics in the first place.